Oh, thanks.
Let's see, do we need to turn on the microphone? Are the microphones live? Yeah, thank you. Good evening. I'm Graham Allison, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the John F. Kennedy School of Government's forum for a reflection on 9/11, 10 years on. 10 years ago this Sunday, Al-Qaeda terrorists attacked the World Trade Center and Pentagon, killing twice as many people as the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the U.S. into World War II. Of those 3,000 souls, citizens were born in 90 different countries. Memories of this horrific event remain vivid for many of us who lost family members or professional colleagues or friends. On that Tuesday morning, 2 jumbo jets took off from Logan Airport, bound for Los Angeles. En route, they were hijacked, transformed into manned, guided cruise missiles, and crashed into the first Tower 1 and then Tower 2 of the World Trade Center. 2 of the hijackers actually stayed at the Charles Hotel next door just before this event. So to help those in the audience, particularly the younger, who may not have as vivid memories of this, we have just a 2-minute video clip, which I think the forum can show us. So this was not Al-Qaeda's first attack, and it was certainly not its last attack. Actually, Americans tend to think only about Al-Qaeda and 9/11, but in the period since 9/11, more than 5,000 other people around the world have been killed by Al-Qaeda attacks. Here's a chart, if you can read it just briefly, of subsequent Al-Qaeda attacks and the body count. And if we put it in map terms, just can you show the map next? Okay, here's a map which will remind us that this is a global phenomenon, not simply a challenge for the United States. So what we're going to do tonight is, with an extraordinary panel, just have a conversation among ourselves in which I'll serve as the interlocutor, and I may actually offer an answer or two as well, in terms of what I think are some of the most important questions about 9/11 10 years on. And then we're going to have a chance for the audience, for people to put questions. Our panel consists of Nick Burns. Nick is a professor of the practice of diplomacy here at the Kennedy School and was the star of his generation in the Foreign Service. Nick was the U.S. ambassador to NATO on that fateful morning. Michael Leiter, sitting beside him, has just recently retired or left the job as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, which is the organization created after 9/11 in the U.S. government for integrating intelligence across the whole spectrum in the war on terror. And Michael and Nick and I were just talking before. He happened, his wedding plans, which he was recently married, was on a day which coincided with the action the U.S. government took that killed Osama bin Laden. So he had, after getting married, to leave his wedding rather quickly to go back to the Situation Room for that event, and he may want to say something more about that. Or not. He's still married, okay? He's still married. And Michael is a graduate of the law school the year 2000. There's a mistake in the program that says 1911. So we were wondering whether it was 1911 or 2011, and he had just come for his degree. Juliette Kayyem is a lecturer here at the school who was formerly an executive director of the Belfer Center. I'm very proud. Juliette served as the Commissioner of Homeland Security in the Duval-Patrick administration here in Massachusetts, and then has just recently come back to Boston after having served in the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary for Homeland Security. So we got a very good representation here. Let me start off with the first question. So what is your own personal, most vivid memory of 9/11?
So that day, I think for me it was this mix of the professional and personal that happened on that day. I had served on the National Commission on Terrorism in 1999 and 2000. This is one of these pre-9/11 commissions that had sort of warned folks about the rising threat of terrorism. On September 11th, I had a 5-year-old newborn and was taking the train to New York City on that morning. And we were hearing all sorts of things through our phones, but couldn't get any images. And I would say it's one of the few times that I sort of use my professional expertise to get people to act. I realized since we didn't have any protocols, the train was still going into New York City. So I sort of just started telling people I would get off, and we were in New Haven. So people start to get off. I think the trains were eventually stopped from coming in. My husband finally comes down to pick us up, and we're driving back, and I'm starting to get media calls, and you're so overwhelmed by the horror, especially when you haven't seen images, because the tower's falling. The sandwich aspect versus the falling over, all sorts of horrors, and the Logan aspect, which impacted Massachusetts. In any event, I started to get media calls and was trying to be the expert. Oh, this is Al-Qaeda, and this is what they mean, whatever. And sitting in the back seat of the car, and I was on a BBC radio program and was, urging, we need to figure out what this is, and we're going to survive this and whatever. And I hang up the phone and just completely burst out crying. And my husband looks at me and he says, some expert you are. But I mean, it was such an emotional day that you couldn't separate the two things.
Right.
I was actually at the Supreme Court that day. I had just started working a couple of weeks prior for Justice Breyer, another Harvard alum. I was one of his 4 law clerks at the time. And I also had a lot of personal connections to the World Trade Center. I was born in Manhattan. I was raised in northern New Jersey, and I had my college graduation dinner, Windows on the World. I'd had my high school prom there. I had been sworn into the Navy there. So the World Trade Center was quite prominent in my adolescence and later life. And we were at the Supreme Court, and I got a call from a friend of mine who had been in the Navy, and he said, Mike, a plane just hit the World Trade Center. And it wasn't like today. We didn't have internet connections at the Supreme Court then. We didn't have TVs everywhere, and they had a small black and white TV, and I ran down to Justice Souter's chambers, and we were watching it. And while we were watching it, of the footage that you saw on the screen, we saw the second plane hit as well. And we both looked at each other and said, oh my God, these planes are coming down. And then we looked at each other and kind of said, well, what else should we be doing? We're here at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is one of the more genteel places in Washington, D.C., and this is an area where we didn't have IDs, and security guards memorized your pictures. And I went back to chambers, and we kind of sat around, and I looked out. My office was on East Capitol Street, so one of the 4 main streets going to the Capitol. And I looked outside, and hundreds and hundreds of people were running from the Capitol away. And we all looked at each other and said, well, should we run away? And we still weren't sure what to do, and then we heard about the Pentagon being hit, and at that point, a Supreme Court police officer, who normally was a very nice guy at the door, showed up with an automatic weapon and said, run, run, run. And we thought that would be a good idea. So we ran, and we got caught in the maelstrom of East Capitol Street, and everyone leaving the Capitol, and we ended up actually in the basement, my basement on Capitol Hill, which is only 3 blocks away. was the only clerk who lived on the Capitol Hill. We went to our basement and we watched it on TV. And at one point, Justice Breyer, who was in India at the time, found out that we were there and he called us. And he, like you, hadn't seen the pictures. He said, "What's going on? What's going on?" And I remember saying, "The World Trade Center isn't there anymore." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "It's gone." And it just, it resonated in a way, but it was impossible to understand. And we spent the rest of the day in my basement listening to the reports about, it turned out to be false, about car bombs and people wondering whether or not they should drive away from the city if there was going to be a chemical or biological attack. And that was my day on 9/11.
Nick, you were in Brussels, yeah?
I was. I was not in the United States. I had just arrived in Brussels as the new U.S. ambassador to NATO, our military alliance. And we couldn't reach Washington after we heard about the attacks because most of the federal government agencies were evacuated, including the State Department. And communications were down for many hours. And we met in emergency session that evening, my 17 European colleagues, the Canadian ambassador, and myself. And the object of this meeting was to decide, well, what do we do? Because we are the defensive alliance, military alliance led by the United States. Lord Robertson asked me to speak first as the country that had been affected. And I remember saying at that point, this could be the bloodiest day in American history since September 1862, since the Battle of Antietam. 23,000 American casualties at that battle. Because of the initial reports and the video, the images from the Pentagon and certainly from New York, the falling towers, led you to believe that we could have had tens of thousands of people dead that day. I thought my brief going into that meeting would be to convince reluctant European allies to support us should we go to war. It was abundantly clear by the evening of the 11th that al-Qaeda was behind this. Most of us figured that was the case. And to my great surprise, every one of those European ambassadors said, we actually want to help the United States. The Canadian ambassador, David Wright, who is our senior, longest-serving ambassador, said, don't you think we ought to invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty? Article 5 of the NATO treaty is the iconic part of the treaty from 1941, all for one and one for all. If one country is attacked, all members of the alliance will go to war. And I was overcome by that offer. And they all said to me that night, we'll come back tomorrow, we'll get permission from our government, and we'll vote this. Early the next morning, I figured I needed some backup from Washington at least. I needed to talk to somebody to get permission to agree that 18 countries would go to war with us. So I called Condoleezza Rice, who was the national security advisor. I think I woke her up at about 4 or 5 in the morning. I said, Condi, the Allies want to invoke Article 5. I kind of need the president's permission to commit the country to this. And she said, go for it. The president will definitely agree because the American people need to know that someone's behind them. And we invoked Article 5 a couple of hours later on September 12th. There was a huge historical irony to this because in the late 1940s, as we created NATO, and there was a real possibility then of a Soviet attack westward into Western Europe, the European allies were not convinced that the United States, the Truman administration, would actually go to war for them, as we had crossed the Atlantic in 1917 and again in 1941, 42, 44 with D-Day. And the Article 5 was written to ensure that the United States would go to the aid of the Europeans. And the irony is the only time it was ever invoked was for the Europeans to go to war with the United States, to come to our aid. And it was an incredible moment of unity. And I thought about that moment in February and March of 2003, as the NATO alliance was torn apart, arguing about whether or not we should go into Iraq. And then when the photos came out from Abu Ghraib, I thought about that moment of unity back in September 12th, 11th and 12th of 2001. And as we then began to argue about Guantanamo and about torture, one was inevitably brought back to this one moment where we had the world with us. And so one of the central questions is, how did we lose that sense of unity and support as the decade wore on? I think it's one of the biggest issues that we as Americans need to reflect on.
Let me offer 2 cents for my own most vivid. I mean, I've got a whole sort of raft of them, but my wife was scheduled to be on American Airlines Flight 11 to Los Angeles on the Tuesday, and we still have that boarding pass. And on Monday, the board meeting, which she was going to on Tuesday, was postponed until Wednesday. Obviously, that flight never went. And Julian and I remember very vividly Jack Fanning, who was the deputy fire commissioner in New York and was a member of the preparation for, what was the thing that you ran?
Domestic preparedness.
Domestic preparedness task force that we had here at the school in 1998, and who led one of the groups who tried to into the World Trade Center to try to put out the fire. So it's again 10 years on, hard to remember. We move on. So 9/11 has been compared to a flash of lightning that illuminates the landscape that was otherwise obscure or clouded. So if 9/11 illuminated the landscape, what are the most significant one or two things that it showed? Julie, what do you?
I mean, I think a couple things, picking up on Nick's point, on the day of, and then I'll fast forward 10 years later, if you could just look at it objectively, the fact that 30,000 people did not die is absolutely unbelievable. And part of that is the tremendous work of, I mean, there are people who were going to die. They were just on the wrong floor. But if you look at a lot of these after actions about what happened on that day, and so that incredible preparedness, and I would ultimately sort of shift in what I was interested in terms of preparedness and homeland security, I think is a great lesson, and one that has tremendous errors and flaws and all the stories about homeland security funding and bloated budgets and whatever else, but I think that is a lesson we shouldn't forget. I think also, and I don't view the 10 years as consistent. I think Nick just went straight for the jugular. Right? We had 2001 and then a whole bunch of things after. For me, I think actually another important pivot point was 2005 and Hurricane Katrina. Because for me, that wasn't just about what happened and why weren't we prepared. That happens in nations. It was, a nation so focused on one singular thing can sort of spectacularly fail in its obligations in another thing. And I think that lesson and that, so for me, 2005 sort of represents another moment in this 10-year cycle in which I wonder sort of, this focus for 10 years that we've all professionally been focusing on also meant there were other things we didn't focus on. And for me, Katrina was really a moment that actually changed what I was interested in as well.
But let me clarify here, because for Michael and Nick, and then come back, because there's another question of what lessons, or at this stage, what do we take away? I was trying to get to just prior to that. So here comes 9/11, this flash of lightning, which causes us to see some things about the world which maybe weren't so evident prior. So if we said, okay, came the flash of lightning, what did we see about the world that either we didn't know before or we didn't know as clearly?
And I'll take your analogy one step farther. Maybe it's implied, I'll make it explicit. I like the lightning analogy because it wasn't an ongoing spotlight. It was a flash of illumination, and everyone knows when you see lightning and you're in kind of an unknown surroundings, you see all sorts of shapes and things out there, but you don't quite know what they are. Right? And that's very much what 9/11 was. It was a moment of illumination, but we still didn't really understand at that point what the landscape of Al-Qaeda and global terrorism was. And we made a lot of assumptions in 2001 that some were right, and I think some over time have certainly proved wrong. But that's important to remember because it does go to trying to explain that not everybody in 2001 had nefarious purposes and saw this as an opportunity to do evil. Simply, there were a lot of unknowns on September 11, 2001, and September 12th and September 13th in 2002 and 2003. But I think the two things I would say that it really did illuminate quite quickly. One was we already were beginning to understand this, but it highlighted how incredibly small the world could be, and how difficult situations in faraway lands really could affect the U.S. in huge national security ways. And this isn't something I think where people in Nick's line of work are always comfortable with this. People coming to Kennedy School are not. The country as a whole often isn't. And I think something like Somalia and Black Hawk Down in 1994, a lot of people said, well, we can just ignore that and it'll go away. And 9/11 taught us that this sort of instability in places throughout the world could really affect us in critical ways. To me, the other thing that it illuminated was, I very much want to stay away from the clash of civilizations. I think it's a terrible phrase. But it did illuminate a pretty profound tension between the United States and our worldview and the worldview of a significant portion of the world. And I don't just mean those like Al-Qaeda, but others throughout much of the Muslim majority world who, frankly, weren't pleased with the way the United States behaved in a lot of contexts. And certainly not all of them are terrorists. A tiny percentage of them are terrorists. But that moment on September 11th illuminated something, I think, for a lot of Americans about we always thought we were doing right, and there were some people who really, really thought the U.S. was doing very wrong. And that was a really important piece of education for us.
I want to pick up on Michael's point and just say I think that the biggest flash understanding for me was shock. The shock of being attacked not by another state, but by, as Tom Friedman put it in one of his books, a bunch of guys, a small group of people with extraordinary evil in their hearts and extraordinary destructive potential. When I drove in this morning, I was listening to Tom Ashford's show on NPR, and he was interviewing George Packer of the New Republic. And Packer, I thought, said something really insightful. He said, the reason we were all shocked, all Americans, is because think of the other days in our history that are comparable. On April 12th, 1861, all those Americans knew when Fort Sumter was bombarded that the Civil War was coming. The Confederacy had formed. Most of the southern states had seceded. Packer went on to say, he said, it was evident to most people on December 7th, 1941, that we were coming to a clash with Japan, and we were going to have to be dragged in to the war against the fascist powers. But nobody understood the morning of the 10th or 11th of September that we were about to embark, and this is Packer's insight, not mine, I give him full credit, on something totally new, and that is that non-state actors, terrorist groups, in this case Al-Qaeda, had enormous power to reach into the heart of our society, strike at the heart of capitalism, Wall Street, at the heart of our power, the Pentagon, and probably, if Flight 93 had not been downed by some courageous passengers, had gone into the White House or the Capitol. This is a new type of warfare. Michael and Juliette have a lot more experience, and they're really the experts here in fighting it. And we owe a lot to them and their community. I don't know if we're safer 10 years later, but we're better prepared. Our national consciousness is more geared as we go to the airport, as we ride trains, to think about the possibility of terrorism and to guard against it. The federal government is fundamentally organized, and I suppose, Juliette, the states are too. So in that sense, we have a more effective policy defensively, but are we safer? Graham is probably best positioned to answer that. When the nuclear genie's out, when North Korea has nuclear weapons, when Iran aspires to, when chemical and biological attacks are possibilities, can we say we're safer? I'd pose that question. Graham, to you.
I thought I was doing the questions.
No, I'm going to question you.
I think it's the question, are we safer than we were on 9/11? Extremely difficult question, just as you said. So you can do the ways in which we're safer, of which there's a long list. And then you can do the other side of the ledger. I would say on the ways in which we're safer, certainly we're now aware in a way that pre-9/11, just what you and Michael were saying we weren't, that we're vulnerable. I mean, basically, my big takeaway from 9/11 in terms of what did it show us was that this security bubble in which many Americans imagined that we lived somehow like apart from the rest of the world in which we were immune to the violence and war that we saw on TV was, no, this was the World Trade Center, excuse me, this was the Pentagon, this was where we lived. So the vulnerability that's rather normal for people in many other countries was kind of an illusion. It was an illusion, but it was still a rooted illusion for Americans that stuff like that just, didn't happen here. So I would say the consciousness of it then makes us all more alert, aware. So today it would be inconceivable that an FBI agent in Phoenix sends in a report that says some guys are wanting to learn to fly airplanes but not to land, and nobody would think it was noteworthy. Okay? I mean, the person in the office. So I would say that more alert. Secondly, the organizational changes, like the one that Juliette was part of, the Department of Homeland Security in the States, the National Counterterrorism Center. So a lot have been organizational arrangements and a lot of effort, so that's for sure. So we could go on down a list of, a dozen others. I'd say that make us safer. On the other hand, and I'd say, sorry, just on that one, if I do a bullet, Al-Qaeda, the group that was the most organized capability, that was the most determined to attack us, has been very substantially weakened. Not eliminated, but seriously weakened. On the other side, there were no nuclear weapons in North Korea. Now there are 10 and 2 tests. So that's bad news. Pakistan, which there were 25 nuclear weapons, now there's 100 in a state that's a lot less stable today than it was in 2001. So that's a danger. Iran, which was spinning no centrifuges on 9/11, has now got enough low-enriched uranium to further enrich would be 5 bombs. So I would say you've got these, two sides of the coin, and trying to net it out, obviously more secure in some space, but uncertain in others. I don't know.
Well, I'll start a little bit of disagreement going on the pattern, so we don't
do.
all say kumbaya. And I'm admittedly biased, having just left the administration two blessed months ago.
Finally had your honeymoon.
Yes. I have zero doubt that we are safer today than we were on 9/11. We have, the enemy is weaker, at least in Pakistan. It's stronger in some places, but that threat is much less deadly than it was on September 10th, 2001 from Pakistan and Afghanistan. The government is markedly different. It is impossible to exaggerate the amount of reform. And I got to see this up close and personal when all the people who had been out of Democratic administrations for 8 years suddenly came back in. And they didn't recognize anything. The change was really revolutionary in the way that the issue is focused upon, the way the information is shared, the thought of how things are disrupted. It is vastly different. So I have no doubt that we are safer today with 2 big caveats. One, the threat of small-scale attacks has undoubtedly gone up because, frankly, in 2001, if you're kind of into this whole al-Qaeda ideology, and there weren't many in the US who were, you didn't think about doing anything anyway. And we do have people here in the United States and overseas today who think of themselves as global warriors in al-Qaeda's battle. And just like that we have school shootings and workplace shootings, those people can buy a gun, take a car, and be pretty destructive. But that is really small scale, and it is nothing to me like the video we saw on the psychological impact that something like 9/11 has on a society. Second, I agree with you in part, Graham, although I'm not as extreme as you are on the threat of nuclear weapons, chemical and biological weapons. And your statements about Pakistan, Iran, North Korea are indisputable. But the question remains whether or not those countries are willing to work with or allow their weapons or materials or expertise to be accessed by extremists and transnational terrorists, and what the world's response would be to that. And although there are more weapons, I think in many ways some of those powers are less likely to allow them to be accessed. there's always the risk of that. And I think the global response to anything like that, whether it was a lost weapon or a state cooperating with an organization like Al-Qaeda or even Hezbollah on weapons of mass destruction, would be probably as quick and as powerful, I hope, as Nick was able to garner on September 12th with the Article 5 invocation.
Julie, what do you, any more on this?
I tend to agree with Mike on this, and for two reasons. One is just the threat itself, and Mike alluded to it, but it used to be that in counterterrorism you could say the following sentence. Well, you know, unlike our European allies who have a problem with a homegrown threat or radicalization, the United States has been relatively free of that. It's still true. It is still predominantly true, but you just simply can't look at the half dozen cases in the last 18 months, maybe more or less, and not think something strange, something not healthy, something violent is going on, and there are a lot of means and a lot of ways to deal with it. And to put it in perspective, though, as Mike said, these are lone actors, so that their capacity to have the spectacular effects that we saw is quite limited. But I also think it's important to answer quite definitively that we are safer now for another reason. And despite the caveats that the two of you are discussing, I think that if we don't pivot away from this notion of a war on terror now, there's not going to be many better opportunities between the killing of bin Laden and 10 years later. We need to think about counterterrorism strategies and effective counterterrorism strategies and homeland security strategies and all that else. But if we don't do that now and sort of recognize that we have limited the threat, we are safer in this regard, and actually as citizens, because we certainly don't give the political space for this, begin to not look at this as a war. We're in this indefinitely, and it has had some great aspects to it, but you know, I'll be the first to remind everyone, it has also had some not such great aspects to it. And we can go through the list, but and so I think it's important to also sort of pivot. If an anniversary provides anything, it might be that.
Let me drill on just one point here, because I think Nick's question is a powerful one, and it's extremely complicated. Okay, so is Al-Qaeda only a pale shadow of the organization that attacked us on 9/11? Yes. And is that a great success of what's occurred since? Absolutely, for sure. But Michael, let me just see whether, because I think maybe we disagree slightly. Does that lead me to think that somebody couldn't kill thousands, so 3,000 people were killed in 9/11, so kill at that scale thousands of people in the US tomorrow? Okay? So I think, well, then wait a minute. So Al-Qaeda was a pretty serious organization. They had their headquarters in Afghanistan. They got these 19 guys, they train them and so forth. So yes, that's now significantly weakened. But then I look at the anthrax attack, which occurred just 1 month after 9/11. So if I believe the FBI report, which I do, one guy did this. One American bio lab worker who makes some anthrax and then decides to distribute it. Now, he distributes it in a very inefficient way, maybe deliberately, maybe not. But with the anthrax he had, appropriately distributed, he could have killed 3,000 people. So now I'm looking back saying, well, how about this guy Shahzad, who would have been a Times Square bomber if he had been more successful? Fortunately, his bomb didn't go off. Okay, so that was the good news. He wasn't a weapon expert, but he might have been a biochemist. I mean, could a biochemist could he? So if I'm just trying to think about, could another, so tomorrow, God forbid, or next year, or the year after, 3,000 people are killed in a terrorist attack in the US. I mean, that could happen, yes?
Well, I mean, that was my nightmare for 4 years, Graham.
Yeah. No, I know, you were. I think you probably thought about this.
Could 3,000 people be killed by the end of this forum and change everything? Yes, it's possible. Is it likely to occur? It is vastly less likely to occur today than it was on September 11th.
Right.
Domestically or overseas. And the anthrax is actually an interesting example. In fact, you had a very, again, assuming the FBI report is correct, you had a very highly trained individual who weaponized anthrax. And yes, he disseminated it in an inefficient way, but it's not that easy to do. And it is hard to kill a lot of people. And you say Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, well, he was just a knucklehead. Well, he probably wasn't the best bomber ever. But what people forget is all of the pieces that were in place that made it less likely that he was a successful bomber. Why did the bomb not go off? Well, one of the reasons the bomb didn't go off was they didn't want to keep him in Pakistan very long to train him. Second, when he wanted to go out and get fertilizer, if he had gone out and gotten fertilizer with nitrates in it, then he would have been reported to the FBI. So he got the wrong fertilizer that wasn't going to blow up. Third, you had kind of the see something, say something campaign of a smart vendor in New York City. Fourth, you had first responders who showed up and knew what to do with it. So there are whole lots of things which combine to make even a small-scale attack less likely, but a large-scale attack even more likely. But don't get me wrong, one of the big issues that we are going to face in our generation, the generation sitting here, is technology makes it easier and easier to kill people. Technology on 9/11 was planes. The future technology that poses the greatest threat will, in my view, be biological and nuclear. And both of those will, over time, it is, I think, indisputable once again, both of those will get increasingly easy to master. It's not going to get harder to create a nuclear device. It is not going to get harder to make virulent forms of biological weapons, which means dumber and dumber people with less and less training are going to be able to harness those technologies for evil. That is a big issue. And frankly, it's a much bigger issue than a homegrown terrorist who really causes tragedy, but kills 2 or 3 people, or even as tragic as it was, Nadal Hassan, the shooting at Fort Hood and killing 13. Those are big issues, and they're still with us.
Okay, let's see if anybody disagrees, and otherwise we'll move on. Yeah.
Would you allow me to pick up on a point that Juliette made?
Please.
Because I think Juliette, is trying to have us look forward a little bit. You suggested that we use this 10th anniversary to think about ending one war and maybe going on to something more purposeful. And I just like to agree with that. And I think, Graham, what I take away, I was trying to think today, what's my key takeaway from the last 10 years? Mine is that we have to remember what an unusual decade it was. We fought 2 land wars, major land wars in the Middle East and South Asia. We'd never done that before in our history, with the sole exception of the 2-front war of 41 to 45. Those wars cost, according to Brown University, $4 trillion, 137,000 Iraqis, Pakistanis, and Afghans dead, 7.8 million refugees, 6,000 American dead. Those are Brown University statistics from a Brown project that I read about in The Economist, preparing for this session. What does that tell me? It tells me 3 things. And here are my 3 takeaways. Number 1, we've got to end both wars. There is no conventional victory available to us in Afghanistan, and there certainly isn't in Iraq. I think President Obama has done absolutely the right thing to have us headed out of Iraq, our combat forces drawn down by December 15. I think the Obama administration has now turned towards a diplomatic strategy in Afghanistan. They want to end the war at the negotiating table, much in the way we had to after the Tet Offensive in '68. We had to end Vietnam at the negotiating table. Get out of both wars. Second, we have been focused for 10 years on an area of the world that's very important, the Middle East and South Asia. There's an area of the world that's more important for our future. It's East Asia. It's the rise of China, the positive opportunities we have with China, and the real challenges. Can we keep the peace with China? Can we avoid a war in the Pacific because of China's rise colliding with American, Japanese, Australian national interests? We've got to focus like a laser on that part of the world. And the 2 wars have prevented us from doing that. And third, and you'll expect me to say this, I run the Future of Diplomacy project here. But think about it. We need to see the return of diplomacy to be the major way we interact with the rest of the world. What was unusual about the last decade was the military was on the front, the point, and diplomacy was in reserve. And usually in international politics, it's the other way around. And the military was asked to do too much. They sacrificed too much. We now face a set of transnational challenges, from climate change to trafficking to crime and drug cartels, and the only way to fight those is through diplomatic action. Now, what we did after 9/11, final point, we reinvented the intelligence community, we invented the Department of Homeland Security, and we reinvented the Pentagon in many ways, and we fully funded all of them. There's a fourth pillar of national security, and it's called the State Department and USAID. And we starved them of funds and didn't pay enough attention to them. I would credit President Obama with having paid a lot more attention to diplomacy.
And it's only going to get worse.
And it may get worse because of our budget debate. If we don't return to thinking that somehow sometimes we need to outwit our enemies at the negotiating table, and use our economic and political leverage and moral force, and as Joe and I would say, our cultural power, to overcome adversaries. That's usually how the United States gets its way in the world. We can't fight everybody. And I think after 9/11, we got into a defensive crouch and began to think, it's our way or the highway, it's us against them, it's black and white, it's good against evil, we're going to hit back. You can only do that so much. And that's my major takeaway.
Can I pivot off of two
Please.
next points? First of all, I entirely agree with him on how weak the fourth pillar is of diplomacy. And it has been weak.
Weakness in funding.
Absolutely, in funding. And that is a concrete problem. And it is driven, I think, or it is, the result of that is where I think we have done worse than any other area in counterterrorism over the past 10 years. And that is in combating the ideology and convincing people that the U.S. is, in fact, a force for good. And that, again, in declining budgets, the State Department and USAID will not benefit. So despite President Obama's, I think, commitment to the State Department and to these programs, they are some of the least popular programs to be funded on the Hill. They don't mean jobs.
There's no national constituency.
It is terrible, and it is a real failing in our system right now, and it's getting worse. The second piece that I want to pivot off of is just from the strict counterterrorism perspective. The past 10 years have been unique in many ways. And one of the things that I think watching that 9/11 video, I mean, how can you not watch that and well, I can't watch that and not get emotional and just start to feel it in your gut again and remember those images of people jumping out those windows and just, I think there is a wonderfully appropriate place for a war for some of this. There are people that we have to go out and kill because they're not going to surrender themselves and they are fighting us and we need to take them off the battlefield. But the repercussions of counterterrorism are not just about body counts on both sides. They are the geopolitical repercussions. And those two wars were the geopolitical repercussions of that event. And future repercussions of terrorism may not involve a lot of people, but they could be huge geopolitically. There were 6 Americans killed in the attack in Mumbai in 2008. 6. But we were as close as we have been in quite some time to having a full-fledged war in South Asia. We have to think about the repercussions of terrorism beyond how many people are killed, because it can wreak terrible havoc and instability in parts of the world that are truly critical to us. And that's what this has done.
Can I?
Yeah, please,
Sorry.
Julie.
So I want to go back to this notion of a war on terror, just for people not to confuse, and Mike will agree, counterterrorism tactics, which clearly involve military action. I mean, no one at this table is going to say, can't we all get along, kumbaya. This is, but the counterterrorism tactics and this sort of global war, GWAT, or war on terror. And I think because the consequences of the GWOT 10 years later are not, I mean, it was a global war on terror and this defensive action that led to tremendous support for the war in Iraq, and I think a feeling that we couldn't wait, right? That was the rationale. And so just to make clear that while there always will be military efforts related to countering al-Qaeda or whatever future terrorist threat there will be, we don't need to conceive of it, and I don't think the government needs to conceive of it as war, because the very things Nick is talking about, that's the consequence. That 10 years later, you look at, we're not even talking about the domestic side of this, right? The agencies that don't even play in our game, but you look at diplomacy and the future of diplomacy and the future of a lot of these nations that could be enemies that we're not even thinking about right now, and we underfund them and we don't pay much attention to them.
And I think it's time to turn to the audience. I'd say my take, you said it's big takeaways from if we reflect on the decade. I was asked to write a piece for the Globe for Sunday, and on what is the big takeaway for the decade for me? And I would say, if you imagine a historian from the middle of the 21st century, so 2050, writing about the first decade after 9/11, and they're thinking of what's the title for the chapter, I would say the decade the locusts ate. The decade the locusts ate. So if I ask whether America is better off today than it was on the day before 9/11, I would say no. And then we could itemize the elements. But I think there was the necessary response, much of which was done extremely well. Then I think there was the mistaken war in Iraq, which I think was an unnecessary war. And then there were the opportunity costs that go back to where you were originally, Nick, in terms of the U.S. as a victim for which there was then almost a solidarity, which were not capitalized on. So I would say historians are not likely to grade this decade as one of our grander. But on that, let's turn to the audience.
I'm not optimistic.
Okay, yes. The game plan here is there are 2 microphones here on the ground floor, and there are 2 in the loges. Please just line up. Any question is welcome, as long as it's brief and is a question. And you can address it to a particular member of the panel or to everybody, though I think to get as many questions as possible, we'll try to, and only just, if one person answers, say disagree if you disagree, but please.
Sure. So my name is Joseph Costa. I'm a researcher here at the Belfer Center. And one of my concerns was the reaction to 9/11. So if we're reflecting on this moment, how the U.S. reacted domestically and internationally, I think it's fair to say there were some pretty significant policy decisions that were made. And this is natural because there's a lot of pressure domestically and we feel we have to react. I'm deeply concerned if there was a larger attack, a WMD attack, on the U.S. government's need or desire to act quickly, where our decision makers have to make very fast decisions with a lot of pressure, with imperfect information. And I know we've taken a number of steps to prepare ourselves in terms of safety and response, but I want to know if there's been any steps taken bureaucratically or internally where we're actually slowing down our decision or protecting ourselves so that we're making a more well thought out or more decisions if there were such attack.
Okay. Michael, you were in the middle of that.
So there's a good news story and a bad news story there. The good news story is that there have been a fair number of steps taken along a number of fronts, and I'll describe them for you. We've thought about, depending on where the attack comes from, what the steps are going to be, and we've thought about it from the perspective of all the government agencies, domestically and overseas, and kind of having a playbook of options, depending on how serious the attack was. What you would do diplomatically, what you would do with international organizations, militarily, Homeland Security, changing visa access, all of these pieces. We've also thought about potential legislation that you might need in a broader emergency. So there's the good news story. The bad news story is people are going to glance at it, and it's going to be overcome by events the minute it starts. And what I fear is, even if people focus on it, it will be very hard, very, very hard, and probably impossible to resist some decision-making, especially getting pushed by the Congress, to do some things that a year or two later we all look back on and say, oh, that might not have been a great idea. But at a time when there's enormous political pressure and there's a 24/7 news cycle and everybody's covering this big event, it's going to be very hard to resist. So I think the planning is there, the thought is there. I'm just not sure we're going to have the political strength of character across the U.S. government to institute some of those really good ideas.
And I'll just add quickly a third thing, which is once it's done, and this is what I experienced probably coming back into government, one of those Clinton people who looked around and said, you guys are all thinking about national security all the time, but that coming in years later is how difficult it is. Once, if those decisions are made that maybe 2 or 3 years later you can say, not so sure that was the way we should have gone, how difficult it is, especially if you're from a different party, to say, you know what, we want to actually change this or pivot out of this or whatever. So I don't want to call it dismantling, but just even changing becomes difficult because you're viewed as soft or weak or different or whatever else. So it's all three of them, I think, together. Let
me just do a footnote on that, and then we'll come to the lows. Rich Falkenrath, who used to be a faculty member here, was a colleague of Juliette's in running this domestic preparedness task force, wrote a rather interesting sort of his 4 takeaways for the Council on Foreign Relations last week. And he was just on your point. His proposition was that in terms of security preparedness, it's kind of a one-way ratchet. So something happens, you have to do something, so you ratchet up. But any president who said, I think we're secure enough now, Osama bin Laden has been killed, Al-Qaeda has been substantially dismantled, we don't need to be quite so alert, would be running a risk that if, God forbid, something happened, he would never be able to, overcome those words. So the politics, trying to understand how the politics of this works, and it ultimately depends on how mature the politics of the society is. Now, some societies, I'd say the Brits are a good example, came to become accustomed to living with a serious terrorist attack, or serious terrorist threat with the Irish, with people being killed from time to time, with an almost successful attack to kill the prime minister, in the cabinet. But life went on. That's pretty far away from the U.S. So if you try to think, Michael, you were there for trying to think of how the politics connects to the, quote, policy wonk.
Yeah. If you think it's going to be hard after the attack, when it is, think about how hard it's been for us to answer some really difficult questions before an attack. We've now gone 10 years. From my take, we still don't have a national agreement on a long-term detention policy for terrorists. Why do you think we're going to make brilliant decisions after the attack if during this whole period we haven't gotten there yet?
So the lady in the loge, please, and introduce yourself.
My name is Farah. I'm a second-year public policy student here, and I'm from Pakistan. Okay. And thank you very much for the discussion. I think we all have benefited from it. But I feel that the role that my country played in the war against terrorism for the last decade is often ignored from the debate for reasons unknown to me. I understand that Pakistan has played a crucial role in combating terrorism. It has been a key US ally. It has provided its territory for drone attacks. It has provided intelligence. We have fought 2 civil wars in Swat and Waziristan. At the same time, we have had Osama bin Laden captured in Pakistan. So how do you, in light of all these events, how do you think the US policy towards Pakistan will change in the next decade?
Okay, so a comment on Pakistan. Nick?
Well, thank you for your question. I think there's no one here, I think, would argue that the Pakistani people and government have not sacrificed over the last 10 years. They certainly have. I mean, all of us are aware of the huge number of Pakistani troops that have been up on the border with Afghanistan. We're aware that the casualties among those troops are very, very severe. And we've seen the impact that terrorism can have within Pakistan itself, with the suicide bombings, with the killings of some of your leading politicians. So I don't think anybody would argue with you at all. From a policy perspective, and I worked with the Pakistani government both when I was at NATO, but also when I was Under Secretary of State in the latter part of the Bush administration, I would have to say this: Pakistan's been an inconsistent ally and an uneven ally in its performance, because everything you said was true, but it's not the full story. With the greatest of respect, the full story would include that Pakistan has given a safe haven to most of the terrorist groups that have been fighting our soldiers and shooting at our soldiers and crossing the border back and forth to the Afghan-Pakistan border to do great damage to our own soldiers and to the Afghan army. It's also true that because of Michael and because of a very courageous decision by President Obama, we were able to get Osama bin Laden without the help of the Pakistani government. And I'm just a private citizen, but I look at that event and I think, is it possible that no one in the Pakistani government knew that he was living in that villa near your military academy? So I think what you may be sensing from a lot of Americans, particularly those who have served in government, is that we understand the strategic importance of Pakistan. We want to see Pakistan and India learn to subdue their differences and avoid the catastrophic nuclear conflict that Michael talked about. But frankly, at this point, I would say that our strategic interests are much more in line with India's in terms of combating counterterrorism and than they are with Pakistan. That India, for instance, I think has been a more reliable ally, partner, if you will, in many ways than Pakistan has been.
Okay. This gentleman, please.
There have been two issues.
Please introduce yourself. Yeah.
My name is Razvan Orashano. I'm a first-year Master of Public Policy student. There have been two issues really that have puzzled me, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to ask them. Number one is the fact that there were so many foreigners actually that perished in that said event. If I was to be very provocative, I would say that there were probably more Mohammeds actually killed on 9/11 than there were Mohammeds plotting. So my question is, why do you think the flag, the American flag, was draped all around this event? Why do you think nobody actually pointed out the facts that here were people actually killing citizens of all countries? That would have been a great way in to get the whole of the world actually with the US government. And my second question is, and I might be accused of oversimplifying this event, and I apologize if I do, but we have been speaking about all notions. We have spawned the globe. We have spoken about Afghanistan, issues with visas, etc. First and foremost, a building collapsed. It has taken 10 years, and it's still not back up again. So my question is, why do you think that is? If the US government has spent $4 trillion without actually, today when we speak, the building being put back up, that to me is extremely puzzling. And if you look at the details of that, they're just gory. The developer fighting with the Port Authority, and an argument going on until 2007 about how to make it, what to make it. To me, it's astonishing that you actually reach Kandahar and you don't sort out New York City.
Okay. We usually one question a customer, but these were two good questions, so you can choose one and answer.
I mean, I actually sort of disagree with your first point. I think where I think there was an acknowledgement about the number of foreigners lost on this day, but I think, for one, the attack was in the United States. I don't know how many foreigners, I'm sure there were, died in the July 7th attacks in London, but they were targeted against US sides. So I sort of think the draping of the flag was was first not done. I actually think there was tremendous outreach and understanding of what other nations had suffered. And second, the motivation of the people who wanted to bring down the towers was clearly, there's a lot of Americans in these buildings. It was not, oh, this is a world network. And then when you think about the Pentagon or wherever the fourth airplane was gonna go. I agree with you that the failure, no one wants to build the same thing. And that is just the way this nation deals with memorials. We don't, and we have a tradition, if you read a lot about memorials, we have a tradition of naming the victims, and all of that is good. So it will, the failure to come to resolution about parts of the area, because other parts are being developed, has been unfortunate. No one's defending it. But on the other hand, it's not as consequential as getting bin Laden, I mean, to be honest. And so if you say, why did you do that so fast? Or how did you kill bin Laden sooner than you built a memorial? I think that might actually be good, that the consequences are much more intense.
The one piece I would add, and his question should be better than your question, that's why he's Nick Burns. But I only offer this up so it's something that you can pursue. I think the more important question, going to your first one, is what happened between September 11th and over the decade that the United States lost much of the coalition that occurred instantaneously. And I actually don't think it was because the US flag was draped over it. Right. I mean, the world felt like they were being attacked. Pakistan, to some extent, felt like it was being attacked. Saudi Arabia felt like it was under attack. The world felt like it was under attack from these terrorists. What happened to that? Because it's quite clear that in our counterterrorism efforts today, we don't have that same coalition that we did. Part of that is inevitable. A passage of time, you lose that depth of emotion. But I think part of it was also policy choices that we and others have made.
Graham, if I could just, and you've asked a really good question. I'm going to do the really easy thing and defend the waving of the flag, if you would permit me. I would just encourage you not to think that the waving of the flag, that our use of the flag was somehow off-putting to non-Americans. The attack, I was overseas, but I was so impressed by the waving of the flag. I came home here about 10 or 12 days after 9/11, and flags were in every doorway of every business and almost every house, and I was proud of that. And I thought we came together after 9/11 as a people. I thought it was one of his best moments, President Bush's, as president. The speech he gave to the Congress, I think on September 20th, was a unifying event. We had a singular purpose. We knew we had to strike back. I didn't think that was negative at all. I think it was positive. And many foreigners were killed, but those attacks were directed against us and at the symbols of our power. And so we had a right, I think, to feel that we had to unite. And the flag is a symbol for us of our patriotism.
Go to this lady in the, please.
Hi, I'm Heather Pickerel. I'm an undergraduate here at Harvard. Earlier, Professor Burns mentioned that not only were our allies supportive of, but actually actively encouraging us to use Article 5. But do you think that this encouragement has died down or diminished in any way over the past 10 years? And if it has, how that has influenced America's political, diplomatic, or military endeavors over the past 10 years, and will it continue to do so in the future?
We could organize an entire course
At
Harvard University.
A great
it's
question.
a really good question.
A great question. Nick, give us a short answer.
My short answer is that I think our allies in Europe and in Asia are tired of the land wars, as are we. But I don't think, and this gets to a point that both Michael and Juliette have made, that they're tired of the struggle against terrorism. The Europeans have known terrorism far longer than we have. They are committed in this struggle, as are our Asian democratic allies. And I feel a great sense of support for the United States and unity internationally against the Al-Qaedas of the world. So that may be a very small silver lining 10 years later.
There's one piece, though, which gets technical, and I won't go into it, but where it is making it harder for the Europeans to fight the war, whatever we call it, with the same vehemence that we, kind of broadly Americans, think it should be fought. And that is, frankly, the sometimes unproductive role that the European Union plays in this. And in my view, there's an increasing tension between not just US counterterrorism priorities, but national European priorities at the state level compared to some of the regulations and policies being enunciated and promulgated across the European Union. Because the European Union and European Commission don't have a responsibility for the safety and security. That's what each state has. And because of that, they are not prioritizing counterterrorism efforts in even the same way that some of those national governments might. And that's an increasing tension.
We're coming close to the end, but we have 3 people at the microphones. So if we do brief questions and brief answers, and this gentleman is next.
Hi, thanks for the panel for a wonderful evening. My name is Joel Branald. I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School. I grew up with my formative years this decade, and to me this is the decade of the victim, where looking around me growing up, those who were powerful were those who could demonstrate a victimhood. And my question is, in the decade that will follow this one, will the victim still be the king? Is that what people should aspire to try and express their power through their victimhood? You know, Professor Allison, in his closing remarks, said the solidarity came through American victimhood. Is that how we want to try and get solidarity today?
Do you mean our own victimhood, if I could just ask? Do you mean our, because
globally, victimhood is being used as the ultimate power player across the world. I think it's propagated this decade far more so than in decades previous.
Look, I just wrote a piece on, I'm going to go the American way, that's what I know better. I actually think one of the remarkable things about the last 10 years is the polling being done on Generation 9/11 and the millennial generation. Because if I can get, I can get really depressed thinking about this too long and my aging process through this, but then when you think about people your age and who are, you don't embrace victimhood. You're much more diverse. You are beyond in numbers of 70% ranges compared to people in our relative age brackets, much lower, much more willing to accept other nations' dominance as well as ours. That's relatively new phenomenon. So all the polling actually suggests that, at least for the American generation that grew up, and the point of this column, if I could say, is actually a lot of you are tattooed, which is really bizarre for your generation, but close to 50% of you have tattoos somewhere. So I know, not us. What you take from that is there's not a victimization over this generation. There's also not an ideology over this generation. You sort of accept the grayness of the world much better than maybe we did. There's not this sort of arrogant exceptionalism that sometimes can reign heavy from the pulpit here. So I actually am quite optimistic.
Very quickly, I'd like to hope that what we're seeing in the Arab awakening suggests that's not the trend. Because I think, if anything, the Arab awakening that we've seen is pushing away from victimhood and towards empowerment.
Okay, this lady.
I'm Daniela Martinez. I'm a lawyer from the law school, an LLM student from Chile. And I wanted to ask all of you, you mentioned at the beginning that the view of the United States in the world changed after 9/11. I want to know if you all agree with that. I would like to know in which way you think the world view changed. And when I talk about the world, I talk about not just the allies or Pakistan or Afghanistan, maybe Latin America as well, countries that were not directly implicated in that. And if this change of view in some ways will inform policy decisions internationally or domestically here in the States.
Good question. Nick, I think you're the man.
Well, I just thank you for your question. I just say this, another takeaway, I've just been trying to reflect, as most of us have, what do we think about 9/11 10 years later? And you know, for me, it's our periodic flirtation with isolationism. It goes all the way back to the founding of our country. We see it now with the Tea Party. We see it with the extreme left of the Democratic Party. Pull back, retreat, no more international engagement, can't afford it, shouldn't do it. And what 9/11 taught me was 6 billion people are afloat on a raft together. Our fate is intertwined with everybody else in the world. And if Al-Qaeda could reach into New York and Washington and strike at the heart of our power, we have to be more global. We have to understand that the world is increasingly interconnected in a way that never has been before. We can't be isolationist. So even at a time of recession and the remarkable lack of confidence that I sense in our political leadership, Democrat and Republican right now, about who we are, We have to continue to try to lead in the world, try to lead with others, as Juliette had said, in the world. That has to be one of the lessons for me of 9/11. Not retreat, not isolationism, not Tea Party, pull the cover over our heads on stormy mornings because it's difficult. So if that answers your question, that's my answer.
Final question in the lows, please.
My name is Mubarak Imam. I'm also from Pakistan, second-year MPID student.
Great.
I was curious about the role of U.S. policy vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia in the war on terror, and what do you think are some of the challenges? Are you comfortable with where the U.S. policy stands? Are there particular changes you'd like to see, and if so, what are they?
I think the relationship with Saudi Arabia has come light years since 9/11. Clearly, I've lost the number, but a significant 15 of the 19 were
15
Saudi.
of 19.
15 of 19 were Saudi. That was a reflection of a larger problem. It wasn't just 15 bad apples. There was problems of funding, problems of education. The Saudis have, over the past 10 years, become one of our most important partners, in part because they themselves and the king feels threatened by al-Qaeda, as they should. So I think the Saudis have become a very good partner. On the financial front, they've done a stellar work. They still have problems with some of their charities, but that is not an easy one to solve. We have the same problems here, so I don't think we should look in the mirror on that. But I think the area where the Saudis have to continue to work is that, and I say, have to be very careful about how I say this, there are some elements within that society of Wahhabism that can produce more fertile ground for extremism. And I think they recognize that now, but that will require a close and ongoing partnership between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to make sure that that does not either undermine Saudi Arabia or pose a threat outside its borders.
Okay, Noella has told me that we have one final question, so this is absolutely the final question. Brief question, brief answer.
Thank you so much. I'm Sharif Basir, I'm from Afghanistan. But my question is not about the intervention in Afghanistan, it's much broader than that. It was interesting to see the views and the question of, is America more secure than we were before 9/11 or 9/11 today? And the responses to that question were quite interesting because it sounds to me that it's still very much inward looking and saying, okay, we have a security system that will deter and sort of prevent the US population from a big attack. But I'm not sure, and I think Professor Burns' responses and comments are quite interesting when he said reaching out and being more diplomatic and using the diplomacy as opposed to the war and the fist and the military response. I'm not sure if the US, and I would like to hear your comments, if you are also thinking of eliminating the threat as opposed to shielding yourself from the threat, actually addressing the root causes of this kind of threat that's coming. I know the US and America and many other countries with the new systems and the security put in place are maybe much more secure than they were on September 10, 2001. But is that, how sustainable is that? Are we really going beyond that? Is that something that Professor Burns is talking about, that reaching out and diplomacy, is that the response? Thanks.
I think that's an excellent question to end on that'll give us a lot to continue to reflect on. Who wants to take a shot at it?
Maybe we can each just say a word to conclude. Thank you for your question. I guess I'd say that we need a strong military to defend ourselves. And I'm not suggesting at all that we weaken our military. I'm just suggesting that the diplomats, the economists, the aid workers, the journalists be on the front line of American foreign policy with the military in reserve. We got it the other way around after 9/11. And that means that we do need to use more of what Joe and I, Professor and I would call our soft power, our negotiating ability, our smarts, to outwit some of the negative actors in the world. But it also means, you're an Afghan. We've had a couple of Pakistani students ask questions. We need 192 nation states to coalesce on this agenda of fighting terror and of trying to get at what you call the root causes. It may be poverty, It may be religion in some cases, but we need every country involved in that. And I think one of the more positive aspects of the last 10 years, at a time of great polarization here in our own country, is that we had a Republican president, George W. Bush, in his second term, really turned towards more multilateral diplomacy. And we've had a Democratic President, Barack Obama, take that, I think, in a really brilliant way and move it forward and begin to rebuild the American image in the world as to how people understood our country. I think that's a bipartisan success in some ways, but we need to build on it, and we need the support of everyone else to have a safer and more peaceful world.
It's a fabulous question, and I'd have about 5 answers for it, and I'm going to try to do it really quickly. First, we are more secure in the homeland, and that's important. Whether here an international audience wants to think it or not, Americans care more about being attacked in the homeland than anywhere else. And we're safer in that way. Second, people really have to understand how much the United States does to keep other nations safe. It is incredible. Now, I'll admit, Afghanistan's a trickier question, as is Iraq. But across Western Europe, across Asia, the United States has done more than any other nation in the world, hands down, to enable those nations to protect themselves from the same scourge. Now, it has required international partnership. And in that sense, whether these attacks were in 2006 targeting British planes flying here or helping the Indonesians taking down Jemaah Islamiyah, the United States has helped other nations become more safe against terrorism. Third, when we talk about more secure, are we more secure or not? Many of the issues that we've touched upon, frankly, just aren't about terrorism. Are we more economically secure? I mean, there's a range of security interests, and I think I can only focus on terrorism, and for terrorism, we are safer. Fourth and last, I know I promised 5, but I'll stop at 4. Fourth and last, we have done some, but not enough, to combat the ideology. Frankly, the world is safer because al-Qaeda's ideology is resonating less today than it was 10 years ago. No matter what polling you look at, the popularity of bin Laden as an individual, the tactics that al-Qaeda used in the form of suicide bombings, that has declined in almost every nation in the world since 2001. There are some trouble spots there still. Nigeria and the attack against the United Nations by Boko Haram. There are some danger zones. But as a general matter, in part because of what the US has done, but frankly more because of what al-Qaeda has done and how heartless it is, the world is safer because we have the Arab awakening and we don't have al-Qaeda sprouting and spreading its violence like we thought it might in 2001.
Juliette, we'll give you the last comment.
I mean, those comments, I'm not going to add anything to that. I want to just pick up quickly something, because they were excellent, that Nick said, which I just think as we end this and think about this 10th year anniversary, look at us, at least those of us who served in government, career in Republican and Democrat administrations, career Republican and Democrat, and across the board, we all admit we've learned to adapt as a nation over the course of this 10 years. And we're all essentially saying the same thing, which is there may have been excesses, there were pivot points over this 10-year period, things we wish we hadn't done that we wish we could redo, and vice versa. And I think where we all end up is maybe where Mike and Nick were just saying, which is these other issues, we want them to take dominance in many ways, that we are safer from terrorism. It will always have a place, unfortunately. And all these other dynamics are actually where we've all ended up with very different backgrounds. So,
well, we haven't come to too many conclusions, but we've come to the end, okay? The topic of 9/11, 10 years on, and lessons of it will be part of I think an avalanche over the next week, and actually relate very directly to lots of the topics that we explore here in the school. But for a good start, let's say thanks to the members of the panel.
Thanks, Mike.
My pleasure.
Really well done.
Oh, thank you.
I agree with you.
I thought you were